The divers surfaced in silence as the current eased, and the object lifted from the riverbed finally broke the dark water. No one spoke. The weight of years and unanswered reports pressed against that moment, unmistakable in shape, yet buried by time and cold sediment below, in its quiet return. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The Spokane River in late October 1981 held no warmth, only the drifting fog lines that settled low over the water and the rusted steel of the Monroe Street Bridge looming above. When local survey teams began scanning the channel for debris and sunken vehicles, they expected nothing more than old metal and discarded engines. Instead, the recovery of a pale blue 1978 Honda Civic, sealed by silt and heavy with secrets, reopened a missing person file that had circulated in Spokane for a year, fatting each month as families moved on, flyers yellowed, and hope thinned. The car's plates matched the registration of 22-year-old Washington State University nursing student, Marcie Lynn Caldwell, last seen leaving her weekend shift at Sacred Heart Medical Center in February 1980. Snowfall that night had been thick, plows slow, and visibility limited, but investigators always suspected more than weather. Her disappearance had left Spokane with a case that held no dramatic headlines, only quiet dread. Inside the vehicle, divers were instructed to maintain integrity, record temperatures, and avoid contamination. Water temperature measured at 43 degrees, interior colder. The passenger side window had been fractured long before recovery, consistent with pressure and impact. The interior offered a snapshot of a vanished life, the faded textbook on hematology, a grocery receipt from the South Hill Albertsons time-stamped 9:14 p.m., and a student cafeteria badge still clipped to her purse strap. Law enforcement secured the vehicle and arranged immediate transport to the county evidence lot, where a controlled drainage and forensic extraction would follow. The body, recovered with procedural restraint and under tarp shielding, was not immediately identifiable, but dental records and a thin gold ring engraved with MLC confirmed what Spokane had anticipated but never resolved. The initial autopsy avoided speculation and followed sequence: clothing inventory, tissue condition, bone assessment, toxicology sampling. Cold water preservation had slowed decomposition, allowing partial preservation of trace material that would have been impossible in soil or summer heat. The cause of death was not listed for weeks. Early notes reflected ambiguous trauma: contusions along the left temporal region, linear abrasion across the clavicle, and a pattern of steering column force from sudden directional impact. Investigators considered the simplest narrative: a slide on black ice, a plunge through unguarded rail, a driver swallowed by snow-fed current. Yet the barrier along the river bend showed no record of collision repairs, and road reports confirmed no guardrail breach from 1979 to 1981. That discrepancy turned a presumed accident into an active homicide review. Detective Raymond Harrelson, then in his 9th year, reopened the file. He began from absence rather than presence. No tire marks logged, no skid reports, no emergency calls from that stretch of road. Witness recollections from February 1980 were revisited. A hospital clerk remembered Marcie clocking out at 9:02 p.m., tired, carrying an anatomy binder, coat unbuttoned against sleet. A neighbor at her Brown's Addition apartment confirmed she never arrived home. Her roommate assumed a late study session and slept. The next morning the car was not parked in its usual street spot. A missing person call was filed after 48 hours, routine yet unsettling. Interviews repeated the same quiet portrait: diligent student, no substance issues, debt manageable, no reported threats, romantic life minimal. Without evidence of struggle or motive, the file moved from active to suspended by late summer 1980. The river changed everything. Spokane media covered the discovery with restrained language. Vehicle pulled from river may clarify 1980 disappearance. Local newscasters stood along banks where fishermen watched, hats low against drizzle. For a week, the city revisited an old ache. Candlelight clusters formed at Sacred Heart, where colleagues remembered her soft handwriting on nursing charts and her last shift in pediatric care. The city's pace slowed, not dramatically but perceptibly, as though a collective memory resurfaced with the car. Harrelson followed the forensic cracks that might not have been cracks at all. The steering column dent, once considered accident impact, aligned instead with a known mechanical weak point in that Honda model, forced turn under duress. The seatbelt, found unlatched, contained minute fibers inconsistent with Marcie's coat fabric, dark wool strands likely transferred from a second party. Water flow patterns confirmed the car entered the river from the east embankment, not the commonly assumed west descent, suggesting someone guided or pushed the vehicle into deeper current rather than slipping from the road's natural slope. Focus shifted to her final hours. Sacred Heart employment logs showed a single name regularly tied to her closing shifts, an orderly named Paul Hexton, 26 at the time, quiet, stable work record, no prior flags. He assisted staff during winter shortages, often walked to the parking garage at the same hour, and lived off East Sprague, not far from the river path. His interview from 1980 had been brief, procedural, inconclusive. He claimed he left minutes before Marcie, took the Monroe route home, saw no stranded vehicles. Without evidence, detectives filed the slip. The vehicle's floor mat changed that. Under ultraviolet analysis, trace residue revealed a chemical compound used in industrial sanitation, specifically the formulation employed at Sacred Heart in 1980 before regulation changes. While Marcie's shoes did carry hospital residue, the concentration on the mat suggested a transfer from someone who handled the compound directly and recently. Her role in pediatric care did not involve sanitation. Orderlies, however, routinely managed disposal rooms and disinfecting cycles. Cold case labs, advancing beyond 1980 limitations, extracted a partial fingerprint from the interior locking mechanism. Moisture degradation left only 7 viable ridge points, but enough for comparative elimination. Marcie's prints matched her steering wheel and purse. The remaining fragment aligned with an archived employment fingerprint card from Sacred Heart, one belonging to Hexton. It placed him inside her vehicle, contradictory to his earlier statement that he never entered it. The re-interview in 1981, now supported by physical linkage, unfolded not in dramatic tension but in methodical legal procedure. Hexton, approached at his new custodial job at a community college, did not flee or deny knowing Marcie. He maintained that he helped her carry textbooks to her car during heavy snowfall, an act omitted from his first statement. The inconsistency was sufficient grounds for court-ordered examination of his 1980 time card discrepancies. Records revealed he clocked out at 9:05 p.m., 3 minutes after Marcie, not before. His insistence of departure order collapsed under timestamp evidence. Investigators reconstructed the route overlay. The pair leaving the hospital lot, traveling west toward the river turn, his claim of walking diverging from the verified road log. A witness surfaced from original police notes, a taxi driver who later apologized for vague recall, who remembered seeing a pale blue Civic idling near the river bridge with 2 figures inside, not one. Snow glare blurred features, but posture and silhouette suggested a heated exchange, though without sensational description. The autopsy addendum, released after careful examination, listed drowning as primary cause but noted pre-mortem concussion likely diminished Marcie's capacity. The pattern of trauma matched not the steering wheel but a blunt interior strike, possibly from abrupt force inside the vehicle. No sharp edges, no malicious overstatements, just the clinical truth of impact preceding submersion. By late December 1981, Spokane County prosecutors assembled a case built not on confession but on sequence, altered statements, fingerprint presence, inconsistent employment logs, and vehicle trajectory incompatible with accident theory. Hexton was arrested under charges of second-degree murder, grounded in reckless endangerment and unlawful restraint leading to death. Trial coverage remained muted, the courthouse quiet beneath early snow. No sensational crowds, only the measured presence of hospital staff, Marcie's family, and reporters who adhered to factual tone. Testimony painted a restrained narrative, a ride offered on a bitter night, an argument over personal boundaries, a sudden turn toward the river overlook, panic, force, and a release of the parking brake while she was dazed. The current completed what intention did not fully articulate. The jury deliberated for 2 days, emerging with a conviction supported by circumstantial structure and forensic advancement uncommon to 1980 files. Hexton received a 28-year sentence, later upheld on appeal. Spokane's landscape returned to routine. Flyers were finally removed from telephone poles on Riverside Avenue. At Sacred Heart, a modest plaque was placed in the pediatric wing, not for tragedy, but for the quiet diligence Marcie brought to her brief work. The river continued its winter run, low and gray, indifferent yet holding the memory of what it returned. The sentencing ended a cycle that had stretched nearly 2 years beyond the night Marcie vanished. Yet the legal conclusion did not immediately translate into emotional closure for Spokane. The city processed the verdict with the same quiet composure that had characterized the case, not through public demonstrations or loud civic response, but through the slow clearing of bulletin boards, the removal of photocopied images from campus hallways, and the gradual fading of a name that had once hovered in every local newscast. For the Caldwell family, the trial confirmed what they had suspected since late 1980, that the accident narrative had never aligned with the daughter they knew, cautious, careful, structured even in her winter driving habits. The river had preserved more than a vehicle. It had preserved the timeline that investigators needed to rebuild a night that had gone dark without witness or documentation. Detective Harrelson submitted his final case summary with a tone that reflected neither triumph nor relief, but completion. The document, 47 pages of forensic logs, roadway measurements, meteorological records, and custodial employment inconsistencies, would remain in courthouse storage after the trial, a file no longer active but still referenced in training sessions for young officers learning the differences between assumed accident and disguised homicide. The closure did not pivot on dramatic confession or emergent witness, but on the patience to wait for technology, the discipline to review old notes without bias, and the river's unexpected role as a long-term archive. Winter 1982 in Spokane carried a muted quality. Downtown storefronts along Riverside displayed post-holiday clearance signs, and the Monroe Street Bridge, once a marker near the site of recovery, resumed its function as unremarkable transit route. Sacred Heart Medical Center adjusted its staff rosters with routine turnover. New nurses arrived, unaware of the case that had briefly reshaped late shifts and security escorts. Yet subtle changes persisted. Parking garage surveillance improved, winter route check-ins were implemented, and pedestrian escort programs extended beyond the emergency wing. Hospital administration framed these adjustments not as response to a singular event, but as procedural evolution. The Caldwell family held a small memorial in March, 1 year after the official recovery. No media coverage attended by request. The ceremony occurred near the riverbank but well above waterline, a quiet section beyond the public park, where the current moved without dramatic whitewater. Those who knew Marcie from her student rotations attended, and a few of her professors traveled from Pullman. The atmosphere aligned with Spokane's winter psychology, measured, subdued, respectful of the gravity without leaning into spectacle. A single floral marker was placed near the embankment, though the city later relocated it to avoid seasonal flooding. Hexton's incarceration unfolded without notable developments. He entered the Washington State Corrections System without pursuit of early interviews or media reinterpretations. His appellate work centered on chain-of-custody arguments rather than innocence claims, but the forensic timeline held firm. The partial fingerprint, though degraded, survived judicial scrutiny because the chain had been documented from river extraction through lab sequencing. In legal summaries, this became a teaching point regarding submerged evidence, that cold freshwater environments, despite their destructive capacities, sometimes preserve microscopic integrity long beyond expectation. The Spokane Police Department gained internal acknowledgement for its handling of the case, not in award format but in updated procedural manuals. The practice of re-interviewing original contacts after evidence resurfacing became codified rather than discretionary. The file did not fade into neglect. Instead, it became instructional material for detectives working missing person cases, where vehicles vanished into water systems across the Northwest. The regional geography, bridges, ravines, winter runoff, necessitated new vigilance. Residents who remembered the original disappearance carried impressions that blended with larger regional memory. The late 1970s and early 1980s had brought infrastructural expansion to Spokane, Expo heritage still fresh, riverfront redevelopment underway. The city was reshaping its identity, yet cases like Marcie's served as sober counterpoint. Local newspapers referenced the investigation only briefly after the verdict, opting for concise crime summaries that avoided narrative flourish. The wording reflected editorial restraint. Unresolved case located, evidence authenticated, conviction secured, community impact ongoing. When university students returned each fall, some encountered the case only through archived library newspapers bound in brittle volumes, a column or two mentioning the river, the Civic, the orderly. They puzzled over its quietness, its absence of cinematic dramatic elements. Yet that was precisely why the narrative remained durable in law enforcement circles. It exemplified the type of file that risked invisibility. A single missing woman in a winter storm, no immediate foul play indicators, vehicle unlocated, presumed weather accident, paperwork cooling into dormancy. Without recovery, it would have joined countless unresolved cases classified under seasonal hazards rather than criminal cause. The river's role continued to draw analytical interest not for sensational purposes, but for hydrological insight. Specialists studied current patterns near the east embankment where the Civic entered, concluding that early spring snowmelt in 1980 likely shifted the car deeper, settling it beneath silt layers until the 1981 survey project destabilized the riverbed during equipment calibration. The chance of recovery, had the survey occurred a year earlier or later, remained uncertain. The convergence of timing, environmental shift, and municipal engineering schedule shaped the difference between permanent disappearance and case reconstruction. Marcie's name appeared once more in official record in August 1982, when a Spokane County annual review listed her case among 5 major resolutions achieved through renewed evidence handling. The entry occupied only a few lines, but it represented bureaucratic acknowledgement. No special memorials followed, no city proclamations, only administrative closure. The understated nature of that listing aligned with the tone that defined her case from disappearance through adjudication. Families of other missing persons contacted Spokane detectives after the verdict, seeking reassurance that river searches and outdated vehicle recoveries would receive similar attention. Although not all received the outcomes they hoped, the department expanded underwater search requests, and local dive units received additional training. The influence of Marcie's case thus extended beyond her individual narrative into the methodology of resolving submerged vehicle disappearances. This ripple effect, though not visible in public awareness, shaped the region's investigative framework. In Brown's addition, where Marcie once shared a modest upstairs apartment, the building changed tenants repeatedly across the following years. Her former roommate relocated to Tri-Cities, carrying with her a box of nursing school notes and a single photograph from their student orientation. These items remained stored rather than displayed, not out of erasure but preservation. Grief in Spokane tended toward inward keeping rather than outward narration. Long after the courtroom quieted, the Spokane River continued its course past industrial brickwork, refurbished downtown plazas, and the constant span of the Monroe Bridge. Residents crossing above seldom thought of the submerged Civic, yet some recalled the brief months when the city paused to acknowledge its return. When winter fog settled low again in 1983, the river appeared unchanged, but the investigative mindset of the city had shifted. Accidents would no longer be assumed without cross-examination of terrain, route, and unspoken timeline. Detective Harrelson retired in 1987, his final exit interview noting the Caldwell case as the most procedurally instructive file of his career. He described it not as remarkable but as clarifying. The absence of overt motive, dramatic pursuit, or sensational detail required more discipline, not less. In future training reports, his notes emphasized that cases solved through submerged recovery often hinge on patience rather than breakthrough witness testimony. By the mid-1990s, Spokane transformed again through downtown renovation, yet the file remained intact in courthouse storage. New detectives could request it for reference. Its edges had softened with time, the paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the structure of the case, vehicle, current, fingerprint, employment gap, remained a model of cumulative forensic effort. The final legacy of the investigation settled not in headlines or commemorative plaques, but in procedural memory. As winters continued across the city, bridges iced, and the river darkened in December light, Spokane carried forward a quiet understanding. That resolution, when it arrived, might do so without spectacle, just the slow emergence of a truth held beneath water until the current chose to return it. The years that followed did not erase the case, but they folded it into Spokane's institutional memory with the subdued dignity that defined its entire trajectory. Marcie Caldwell's name surfaced occasionally in training syllabi, cited not for notoriety, but for the precision required when a disappearance initially resembled an accident. Law enforcement cadets at the academy reviewed a condensed version of her file, examining the timeline that bridged February 1980 to the river recovery in October 1981. The lesson focused on restraint, the discipline to avoid premature categorization, the patience to allow environmental factors to reveal evidence that remained beyond human reach for more than a year. For many, the case served as reminder that resolution is not always the product of pursuit, but of persistence, and environmental return. Spokane matured through the 1980s and into the 1990s, reshaping its riverfront while preserving the stark winter calm that had always characterized the city's identity. Riverside Avenue gained storefront renovations, cafe lights, and new transit routes, yet the river remained constant. Gray, cold, occasionally swollen with meltwater, but fundamentally unchanged. The Civic, long removed, no longer defined the bend near the East Embankment, yet divers and recovery personnel continued to reference the location as a training point. In annual refresher courses, instructors stood at the bank and quietly indicated the stretch where long-submerged truth resurfaced without theatrics. The site never became a marked memorial. It did not require one. Detective Harrelson's retirement did not mark an endpoint for the investigative principles forged through the case. His successor, Lieutenant Jenna Morley, maintained the annual review protocol he established, ensuring that unresolved disappearances involving waterways received renewed attention with each advancement in search technology. Sonar mapping, once limited and imprecise, developed into a detailed imaging system capable of reading sediment shifts along the river floor. Instructors reminded new technicians that the Caldwell case emerged not because someone looked harder, but because someone finally looked differently. That distinction echoed through every winter search briefing thereafter. Media references to the case became rare as Spokane evolved. Newspapers transitioned to digital archives, and what had once been a front-page recovery now occupied a quiet corner of searchable microfilm. Yet students at Washington State University occasionally encountered the story in criminology electives, typically as a footnote in a chapter on aquatic evidence preservation. They studied the survival of fingerprint ridge points despite long-term submersion, the cold shock patterns that slowed organic breakdown, and the forensic utility of river silt when cataloged correctly. Their instructors emphasized that the case did not require sensational interpretation. Its significance lay in accuracy, not spectacle. The Caldwell family remained largely private. Their correspondence with the Spokane Police Department decreased after 1982, replaced by infrequent holiday cards acknowledging continuing support. They did not pursue media appearances or retrospective interviews. Their mourning remained steady, grounded in the knowledge that resolution had arrived through lawful means rather than conjecture. On anniversaries, they did not gather at the riverbank, preferring instead the modest cemetery site where Marcie's marker rested beneath silvered pine. Spokane residents understood this preference without comment. Silence, like current, remained part of the city's temperament. Hexton's sentence progressed without incident. By the early 2000s, correctional oversight records described him as compliant, reserved, and vocationally involved in facility maintenance. He filed no new appeals. Psychological evaluations noted absence of documented aggression, but presence of sustained detachment, a characteristic that had once helped him avoid scrutiny. His eligibility for parole hearing arrived after 2 decades, but the board denied release, citing the calculated nature of his actions and the irreversible consequences. The denial did not spark public debate. Community sentiment remained consistent and restrained. Spokane's dive unit expanded throughout the early 21st century, adopting winter-specific reconnaissance that had not existed in 1980. Cold water immersion protocols became routine, guided by environmental modeling that predicted areas where vehicles might settle and remain concealed beneath shifting deposits. Instructors reminded trainees that submerged cases are not merely underwater searches, but reconstructions of interrupted timelines. The Caldwell file became a foundational example, not because the crime itself deviated from human motive, but because nature played an extended role in evidence retention. As decades passed, the Monroe Street Bridge continued to cast its long shadow over the river, joining traffic noise with the low churn of winter flow. Commuters moved across unaware of the quiet history below, yet the city's emergency teams never forgot. When new cases, unrelated but similarly obscured by distance and water, surfaced in the region, Spokane authorities responded with procedural confidence shaped by their past. They no longer assumed lost vehicles were accidental. They no longer treated riverbeds as terminal archives. They understood that water preserves as much as it conceals. In 2011, on the 30th year since the Civic rose from the riverbed, Sacred Heart Medical Center placed a minor notation in an internal staff bulletin acknowledging the anniversary of safety reforms. The message did not state Marcie's name directly, but referred to the policy shifts that had followed her disappearance. Staff unfamiliar with the original case read the entry without deeper recognition, simply absorbing it as part of institutional history. Those who remembered understood the reference immediately. The hospital's winter escort program continued unchanged, its presence routine but effective. By the time Spokane entered the 2020s, the Caldwell case existed primarily as structured record, a solved cold case that altered procedural landscapes without redefining civic identity. Its endurance rested not in retelling but in retention. The river still moved through the center of the city, measured, opaque, indifferent to human memory, yet undeniably tied to a moment when it returned what had been lost. Each winter, as fog settled along its surface and ice rimmed the banks, Spokane's investigators recognized the current not as threat or omen, but as archive. What it yielded once, it could yield again. In the end, the legacy remained precise, unsentimental, and methodical. A missing nursing student, a submerged vehicle, a fingerprint preserved by cold water, a revised timeline and lawful conviction without spectacle. Spokane continued forward with its quiet winters, its steady river, and its unremarkable bridges, carrying the understanding that truth sometimes rises not through pursuit but through patience, pressure, and the eventual shift of silt.